I'm Ben Wattenberg. It was here at Ford's Theater in 1865 that America's 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, was shot by John Wilkes Booth. Afterward, the assassin leapt from that balcony, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," or "Thus always to tyrants," and "The South is avenged." Lincoln has been called many things: savior, tyrant, liberator, racist, saint, poet, idealist, pragmatist. It has been said that every generation and almost every cause recasts Lincoln for its own purposes. Was he really a visionary leader who set out to reshape America, or was he just a practical politician forced to cope with extraordinary events? Joining us are three leading American historians: David Herbert Donald, professor of history emeritus at Harvard University, two-time Pulitzer-prize winner and author of the new biography, Lincoln; Daniel Boorstin, librarian of Congress emeritus and author of the Pulitzer-prize winning series, The Americans, and most recently, the Daniel J. Boorstin Reader; and Eric Foner, professor of history at Columbia University, editor of the Reader's Companion to American History, and author of A House Divided, America in the Age of Lincoln. The question before us here at Ford's Theater, which is still in operation today: who was Abraham Lincoln? This week on Think Tank. For much of his life, Abraham Lincoln seemed an unlikely candidate for the title Savior of the Republic. Born in Hardin, Kentucky in 1809, Lincoln spent his early years as a country lawyer and Illinois state representative. He gained national attention by debating Senator Stephen Douglas during their contest for an Illinois Senate seat. The issue that divided them and divided the country was the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Lincoln lost the election, but won the hearts of most of his countrymen. Lincoln believed slavery was an immoral institution. He opposed its spread and believed America could not be half slave and half free. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he said. In 1860, Lincoln won the presidential nomination of the recently formed Republican Party. Many in that party favored his moderate opposition to slavery. Touting his humble origins, his followers hailed him as Honest Abe, the rail splitter. In a four-way race that many said was tearing apart the nation, Lincoln won the White House with just 39.8% of the vote. After his election, the southern states seceded from the Union. Within 6 weeks of his inauguration, the Civil War began. On January 1st, 1863, with the war dead mounting, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. After Lincoln was assassinated in this very theater, he was carried across the street. He died the following morning. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let us begin with a very simple question. Professor David Herbert Donald, what kind of a man was Abraham Lincoln?
If I were going to devise a brief epitaph for Abraham Lincoln, I would say savior of the Union, emancipator of the slaves, model of a democratic leader. That would be my formulation.
Okay, Professor Eric Foner.
Well, I can't disagree with what Professor Donald said. I would just add that to me, Lincoln's greatness is his capacity to grow into those roles. He was a man of his times, but somehow he was able to transcend his time when it became necessary. And even at the very end of his life, his views on issues which are so important to us today, such as race relations, were still evolving and moving forward. He was never stuck in a sort of dogmatic position, and that, I think, accounts for his ability to be a great democratic leader.
Dan Boorstin, I gather you had a semi-personal encounter with the great emancipator?
Well, yes, it was a rather intimate encounter because when I was walked into the office of the Librarian of Congress for the first time.
When you assumed that office?
Some years ago, and Ruth was with me, and we looked around the office, and we looked in the vault. There was a vault there. We looked in the vault. In the vault, there was a box, a shoe box, which had a label on it, "Do not open. Contents of the pockets of Abraham Lincoln on the night he was assassinated."
Wow.
So, of course, we naturally opened it immediately. And we found among the contents, we found a pair of broken eyeglasses, and we found a penknife, a partly broken penknife, but most interestingly, a billfold which had two things in it that were quite significant. One, a clipping of a speech by John Bright in the House of Commons praising Lincoln as one of the greatest men who ever lived, which was rather well worn, as if he'd taken it out many times to read, and also a Confederate $10 bill, which was insurance, I suppose.
We hear so much in the folklore about Lincoln, about his rural backwoods background. He almost comes across sometimes as sort of a hick. Is that accurate?
Well, in the first place, that's a carefully cultivated image. Lincoln knew the power of being the self-made man, the man of the people, the rail splitter. He was all of those things, but of course he was a great deal more than that. For instance, he had done a lot of manual work in his time, but he didn't like to do physical labor, and that's the reason he entered politics and the law. He was not a man of great social graces initially, but his wife helped him a great deal and helped address this rather awkward man so that he looked really quite elegant, and toward the end of his life he was behaving with some gallantry toward ladies whom he earlier had been praised.
Question in that connection. Yeah. Why did he wear a stovepipe hat?
I have never known.
I've looked in I read your book with great interest, but that's one thing that didn't find it enough.
It is an odd thing that a man 6'4" would add that height. And we have to remember that 6'4" in those days was gigantic. The average height of Americans was, of course, so much less than it is today. There were no 7-foot basketball players around the country. And so he was so tall, he stood out in any crowd. And why you would add another foot is beyond me, except he found it very useful for storage. It was the place that he put his papers. And if he couldn't find anything, he would take his hat off and go to rumble around in those papers and find the document that he was looking for. That's the only reason that I can come up with, but I don't know. He did occasionally wear what he called a plug hat, a soft hat, but the tall hat was his trademark.
One of the difficulties understanding Lincoln is that he's been so overlaid with myth and legend. Of course, Washington was too. Washington was mythologized. But there were not so many legends about Washington. There was the cherry tree, and there were a few others, Valley Forge and other places. But in the case of Lincoln, his whole life is full of legend, beginning with his birth in a log cabin with the Anne Rutledge affair and so on. And I think that the reason why one reason why he challenges our imagination and has become so legendary is that he is the representative American. Now, you know, when we look at heroes, Carlyle wrote a book called Heroes and Hero Worship. And he said that the great figures in history are those who are charismatic, who have the divine afflatus, who are above everybody else. But Emerson then contrasted that notion, which he borrowed partly from Carlyle, to the idea of the representative man, the man who embodies the common virtues, the common qualities to an extraordinary degree. And I think that's what Lincoln did.
Let me ask you a question. You've all sort of indicated that he both was and appeared to be a man of the people. It is said by some these days that his early views, at least, would today be characterized as racist. Was that what Americans were then, or was that what Lincoln, coming from what a border state?
Well, you have to remember that in the mid-19th century, what racist views were very widespread in the North as well as the South, and not only among people who had migrated from southern states into the North. Lincoln shared many of those prejudices, there's no question, growing up, and as a careful politician, he was not going to go way out on a limb like many abolitionists did to demand equal rights for blacks in the North. But on the other hand, he always insisted that blacks were entitled to the basic rights of humanity, the rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, we may say, well, that's not saying much, but there were many Americans, Stephen A. Douglas, for example, who said, no, that's only for white people. The Declaration only applies to whites. Blacks, Africans have no standing as citizens. After all, the Dred Scott decision, the law of the land in 1857, said a black person cannot be a citizen of the United States. So, yes, Lincoln, by modern standards, appears to have what Professor Donald, I think, called very short-sighted views on race. But the other point is, as I said, he evolved, he changed. In his last speech, he was calling, or saying at least, that he favored giving some blacks the right to vote after the Civil War, which was certainly a minority position even after emancipation.
What were the essence of the Lincoln-Douglas debates? What was that all about? We've sort of heard so much about it.
Well, the issue, first of all, specifically is who's going to be elected senator from Illinois. They were not elected directly, but you elected a legislature who elected the senator. So Stephen A. Douglas for the Democrats, Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans, they were running in 1858. At issue here really is the question of the spread of slavery into the national territories, which Douglas had opened in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that's what really triggered Lincoln's major political career. He found slavery morally wrong. He'd always thought slavery morally wrong. Back in 1837, he'd issued a statement in the Illinois State Legislature denouncing slavery. But now he feared that it was going to expand in the North. This then gave the occasion, first of all, to fight an old antagonist, a bitter rival in Illinois politics, on a high moral principle, namely that slavery must not be allowed to expand. This did not mean, as Eric says, it did not mean racial equality, but it meant no more expansion of slavery.
But it also meant, to add to that, in a sense, Lincoln is calling for a national decision about slavery. That's what he said in the House Divided speech, which was the opening shot of the senatorial campaign. This is a decision that has to be made by the nation, that slavery is going to be stopped from spreading and, as he said, put in the course of ultimate extinction. Now, ultimate extinction may be a long time away, but to Southerners, that was a very frightening concept. And Douglas insisted, no, this is a local problem. Localities ought to decide it, states in the South, territories. What is it our business in Illinois, whether people in Kansas or in Mississippi have slavery or not? And as David said, Lincoln insisted this is a paramount moral question and it requires a national decision. It can't be decided ad hoc in all sorts of different local communities.
Well, don't you think his position there also expressed a certain practical attitude toward the problem? That is a belief in institutions, not in ideology, not in theories, but in the importance of the Union, of this institution that had protected the freedom of the free, which he referred to, and that was necessary in order to perpetuate the life of the nation.
That was his single overriding concern as president, was the preservation of the Union. That was above everything.
That above everything else, because, as Dan Boorstin has just said, that was going to bring about the other goals that he wished to promote.
But it's also,
I'm sorry, Dan. No. Go ahead.
Go
ahead. All right. What I was going to say is that, yes, Lincoln was devoted to the Union. William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, burned the Constitution. Lincoln would never have thought of doing something like that. On the other hand, to say that he is simply devoted to the Union, many positions could follow from that. For example, in the secession crisis, Lincoln opposed compromise to save the Union. There were many who said, well, then let's give up on this question of the expansion of slavery, or let's draw a line through the territories. Lincoln said, no, I'm not going to compromise the principle of the non-extension of slavery, even if it will settle this crisis of the Union right now. So that Lincoln was devoted to the Union, but it had to be a Union that stood for certain principles, the principle of democracy, and also this principle of freedom being the normal national condition and slavery being an aberration which had been put on this course of ultimate extinction.
If Lincoln knew when he became president that by pursuing this war, 640,000 Americans on both sides would be killed, the largest slaughter of Americans before or since.
It was the bloodiest war of the 19th century, too, I think.
Right.
Anywhere.
Do you think he would have gone ahead?
Well, nobody could have that kind of foreknowledge. This is as unrealistic as to ask about World War I or World War II or Vietnam as far as that's concerned. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. And Lincoln, when he became president, thought that by upholding the Union, by encouraging Unionists in the South, that the secessionists would change their minds, that many of them would come back to the Union, and that this would be a false alarm. So he didn't think he was provoking a major war. He thought he was getting over a rather local crisis.
But Lincoln was willing, as you show in your book, as the war went on and it became very clear what kind of war this was becoming and how the casualties were mounting and mounting, Lincoln never said, well, then let's give it up. He was willing. He didn't know in 1860, but he knew by 1864 what this war was. And there were people like Horace Greeley and others who were saying, well, let's negotiate, let's have a compromise, let's maybe give up the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln was never willing to do that.
What is it that so entrances Americans today and Americans ever since the time Lincoln was killed?
Well,
about Lincoln, why has he become probably the central figure of our history?
Well, he was the first American president to be assassinated. That gives a kind of an aura here. Second, he preserved the Union. He was at a major turning point in American history. He, more than any other man, was responsible for emancipating the slaves. This is not to suggest that slaves weren't emancipating themselves in part, but he gave legal recognition to this. So the positions that he took, the policies he followed, ensured that he would have to have this kind of recognition. But you have to go beyond that, I think, then to the language and the rhetoric. There is certainly no other American president who had anything like the command of the English language. If you look in Bartlett's familiar quotations, for example, you'll find, a few quotations from George Washington, more from Thomas Jefferson. Most American presidents, no quotations at all. Long pages of Lincoln, and you look at them and you say, my, those are as memorable. I knew them all the time. They're just like quotations from Shakespeare. Everybody knows them. And then going maybe one step further, there is just the matter of character and of personality. This was an enormously engaging man. He was a very funny man, the first humorist we've ever had in the American presidency, maybe the last one.
Humorist. The first intentional
humorist. Yes, that is the point well.
There's another aspect to his appeal, which I think is not unrelated to what you said, David, and that is he was really the American representative man. And one of the reasons was that he was the amateur. And the man of no considerable military experience, really, directing the largest military operation that had been conducted in this country. And in that sense, he expressed what I think is a key to democracy. It is government by amateurs. And people realize that.
By professional amateurs.
Well, they become professional.
Right. Lincoln is not
a...
But
he's an amateur. He certainly is an amateur in the military world, is he?
No, absolutely. What I was going to say is Lincoln is not a hero to everybody. I mean, there are and always have been Americans who have bitterly criticized Lincoln.
To this day.
To this day. In the 1960s, as you suggested earlier, there were black writers who said Lincoln is a racist. Or Malcolm X said, take down the picture, addressing blacks. What he was really saying was, don't rely on a white emancipator to solve your problems.
And there's a whole
Today there's the Southern League, which is, call themselves sort of neo-Confederates, who are claiming Lincoln was a tyrant who, invaded the South and conquered it and really, destroyed the Union based on individual states.
Changed the Constitution away from states' rights.
Yes, they say that Lincoln, by virtue of the Civil War, changed the Constitution from a state-centered document to a nationally centered document, which of course I think did happen, but more after he was dead through the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, which did shift power in the federal government very radically, yes.
Where would Lincoln come down today? I mean, if he walked out of Ford's Theater and went up to Capitol Hill and took his seat in the Congress, what do you think he'd be up to?
Well, I'll offer that he wouldn't be at all surprised that for the entire period of his presidency, he was sniped at, he was berated, he was denounced not merely by the opposing party, but by members of his own party, that he was so pleased when Congress went into recess because he said, finally we could get some business done on our own. I think he would find it just like old times.
He would not be surprised at the so-called lack of civility.
Well, I think he would be dismayed at the lack of confidence in government, because after all, his whole campaign, his whole life was devoted to affirming the importance of the Union. That's government. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, I'm afraid we find a little too much of what I would call a Neoanarchism, of belief that the government's evil at any level.
Lincoln's own party, primarily. He would have been surprised by the Republicans.
I think he would have been
saying
shocked.
this, right?
Republicans saying
you buy that? I don't want to let that go unchallenged. I mean, would Lincoln be a liberal Democrat today?
No. I think, first of all, Lincoln was a party man. He stuck to his political affiliation. He was a Whig after the Whig Party died. He would have been a Republican after the Republican Party may in turn die. I don't think he would ever have switched, no. He did not like Jacksonians in general. But he would not have been a Democrat.
But I think
he went Republican, didn't he, from
yes,
Whig?
Yes.
Well, he didn't switch because there was no place to go. The Whigs would did. He had to go somewhere.
But he would have, I think, as Dan suggested, felt that there are some kinds of problems which the national government has to address, that by simply dismantling the national government, you are not going to solve all these problems.
Why does Lincoln endure so much more than all the other presidents?
Well, if I can say to begin, Lincoln endures for the reasons we have heard about as a representative man, his brilliance in many ways, but I think he endures because the fundamental issue of his presidency still endures. That is to say, not slavery, but the legacy of slavery. What is going to be the status of these people who were slaves and their descendants in our society? That was unresolved at the end of the Civil War. Lincoln began addressing it, but of course was assassinated. And in some ways, we still have not quite solved that problem. In his second inaugural, he spoke of the 250 years of unrequited toil of the slave, and in a sense, challenging the nation to think about what the legacy, what is the meaning of that for American history? And as long as that problem persists in our society, Lincoln will still have meaning to us.
Dan?
Well, I think he really does affirm the values that our nation stands for. And I think people realize that. And I think that the opportunity for people to rise, regardless of race, and that then having risen, they should have the opportunity to speak their mind and be themselves. And that was the tradition that he affirmed, which I think still is the mainstream of American life.
Okay.
Following up what my colleagues here have said, I just add one more ingredient to Lincoln's perennial appeal. That is his style as a democratic leader. That is the slow, cautious building of a consensus, never going far out front and saying, this is the position we must all follow, but working closely with small groups. After all, he had such a minority behind him in his first election, until he could get a consensus and a real backing for important measures like the 13th Amendment. So that this is a style of democratic leadership unknown, I think, in foreign countries, that makes Lincoln a distinctively American figure.
Thank you very much, David Herbert Donald and Eric Foner, Daniel Boorstin, and thank you.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.